خير. اليوم عاطف nous invite son ami Jason. Donc مرحبا بعاطف، مرحبا بجيسون. عاطف بريزونتوا ton ami.
مرحبا بكم. اليوم عملنا سيسيون هكا ان بو سبيسيال خارجه من لي سونتي باتو. جيسون هو واحد كنديان انديجين، وعرفته 3 سنين تالي في عملنا الماستر كلاس في استراليا مع بلاد ماركس، وباش يقدم لنا الخدمه نتاعو، الباك جراوند نتاعو، منين جاي، شنو هو الكوميونيتي نتاعو، كيفاش عايشين في الطبيعه. سي لي تشالنج اللي يلقاهم توا اللي هما ابوبري نفس لي تشالنج ابوبري في العالم الكل.
Okay, you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to just run you through a short presentation on kind of my work and my area of expertise. I'll talk about the past, the present, and where we're headed, and kind of the future of my work. So just to give you some context, that's what part of the world I live in and where I work. So you can kind of see it's just on the edge of the prairies, the plains in the boreal forest area in central Canada. And this is just zoomed in, so you can kind of see the hatched area there. Is close by to where I live and where I grew up. I traveled around quite a bit for school, but I'm now living close to home and working with local communities on different kinds of projects. These are just some old family photos, just to kind of give you some more context on where I come from. So we've been in kind of building and like lumber making and stuff for quite a long time on my mom's side of my family. So this are old photos of our sawmill that they used to operate making lumber. This is my great grandpa here. He used to run the sawmill. These are just, I have a few images just to kind of give you some like texture of what the landscape looks like here. So it's mixed lakes and forest, rivers, lots of animals. So it's definitely kind of it's very rural, kind of like a wilderness area. Not a lot of large cities or density of population. Our province only has 1 million people. So these are some of the animals, some of the berries and mushrooms. So we spend a lot of time out on the land harvesting different food, different animals, different medicines, that kind of stuff. And then to give you some context on Canada's Indigenous people specifically, they're divided into 3 groups. So in the north, you have the Inuit people. You have First Nations people that are kind of scattered throughout Canada. And there is, I think, over 600 different distinct First Nations groups in the country, or communities. So the First Nations people in Canada are very diverse. And then there's the Métis people, which is a French word, and it just means like a mixed ancestry. And the Métis people kind of, their boundaries aren't really defined definitively, but they're kind of in this area, if you can see the cursor, in the central part of the country. So just to give you like a little bit more context on my family and my background, my dad's side they're European immigrants that came about 120 or 30 years ago. And my mom's side of the family are Métis. So they're that Indigenous group of people I was mentioning, which I'll run through here in a little more detail. So there's just kind of a brief description talking about Métis people, and the takeaway from this is that like the Métis people are very like egalitarian and like kind of socialist in their organization and stuff, and all about consensus and like sharing and trading among families. So here's an old painting that you see lots when it comes to Métis people. So a lot of the Métis people made a living and trade on trapping and furs and hunting bison up until like the late 1800s, when the bison were hunted nearly to extinction by the government. It was part of their program to kind of try to take people off land, was to hunt the bison out because it was a main food source for economy for our people. So this is one of our leaders who is a buffalo hunter and kind of is like an icon of our nation, who lived about 100 years ago. Some of the cultural practices, like we hunt, as you saw, we fish quite a bit, we trap, gather from the land. There's a large like building component, kind of handcraft component to our culture. So this is an image I did for my thesis work, somebody tanning a hide, like making leather in a traditional way, that I kind of just a drawing I've done. Another drawing I've done of like making dry meat and processing wild game as a way we preserve it. There's another image of Métis people about 100 years ago on the prairies traveling. So you can kind of see this like semi-nomadic architecture, which I really like this image. We'll probably get into this later, but like I did see some like images of tents and stuff of the Berber people, and like kind of I could draw some like similarities between this image, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. Here's another image. So there were a lot of, as people started to settle down in like the late 1800s, the Métis kind of developed their own distinct architectural form, where they did like a dovetail log cabin like this. And there's examples of these all over. Some are still standing, like well over 100 years old. And it was like a single room dwelling on the inside, but very European on the outside. And I kind of like spoke to their makeup as people. They were, you know, a mix between European and indigenous people that like intermarried and had their own distinct like culture and language in the 1800s. So this like structure, this like typology is kind of like a hybrid between those two cultures, you can see. Here's another primitive building, or like a building that was built by Métis people to overwinter. And they would kind of stop in an area and build a structure to spend a winter in. So you see like lots of log structure, heavy timber. Here's another one. I took this photo a couple years ago, and it's still standing. It's clearly like it's degrading, you know, but it's over 100 years old as well, probably built in the late 1800s. Here's a sketch of the interior of these homes. Like I was saying, it's a one-room dwelling, you know, with a central fire, central hearth, which is like, you know, if you look at the teepee and the First Nations way of dwelling here, it was a canvas structure, you know, but with a central hearth. So they are kind of similar, but this is just like more of a hybrid, like I was saying. So here's some more images. So this is another example of that house. You can kind of see the proportions are the same and the way they're built are the same. And these are all over the territory, like Métis homeland. These are some drawings I did and research I did on these houses. So I went and like 3D modeled all of these and pulled sections, did isometrics, exploded them just to understand like the tectonics. So moving into like where we're kind of at now in terms of housing, a lot happened kind of between those last images and now. Canada became a country in the late 1800s. The government started to take control of housing programs for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So they started to build a lot of these kinds of houses and communities, and have been building these for a long time. They're placeless, they're culturally irrelevant, they're built very poorly. So the housing in most situations in the country is managed by the government. But you'll see the same house built on one side of Canada in a First Nations community as the other side of Canada. Even though the technology in them doesn't work, there's a lot of mold issues with these houses, or leaking. There's overcrowding. Sometimes you'll see like 18, 19, 20 people living in a house like this. So the government has really, they started to control the housing for these communities, but it hasn't really, as you can see, like these buildings aren't made to last compared to the images I had shown before, you know, where they're still standing over 100 years later. So you can start to see like these houses are put up by the government, but they're very substandard housing that they're providing for communities. And they have a blanket approach to the housing. And then in terms of non-residential work, like where we're at for this like Indigenous architecture, you're seeing a lot of just cookie cutter buildings that could be anywhere in Canada. Like you see schools like this all over. firms are profiting a lot of money off working for First Nations. So what I did here is, you'll see this image just looks like any other school. And then this is actually what was built. So I'll flip back and forth. You can see, so to like indigenize these buildings and make them like an indigenous architecture, they're calling it. You can see on the left and the right, all they're doing is adding these like visual lexicons, these symbols, you know, and that is like a traditional typology of a First Nations teepee, but it's not, it's just an object, you know, it's just like adding something on the side. So we're seeing a lot of that in Canada these days. Not, you know, it's not meaningful consultation and it's not community led. So those are some of the traditional typologies we'll see across the country. They're very diverse. It's all like regional. You know, the Indigenous people in Canada, they all built totally different structures depending on local materials and climate. They see an igloo, a teepee, a longhouse, a wigwam, and then a West Coast longhouse. Those are kind of just little graphics I've drawn. So where we're headed now is really positive. There's a lot of Indigenous architects that are registered. Well, there's not enough, I guess I should say. There's about 20 in Canada, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit architects. And there should be about 300 if you do if you extrapolate the numbers of population of Indigenous people to population of Canada, and then Indigenous and non-Indigenous architects. We're at like maybe, you know, only about 10% of what we should have. But we're getting there. We formed a Indigenous task force, we call it, in architecture. So it's a group of all the Indigenous architects in Canada. And we all work together on a task force. It's kind of growing and shaping. It's not like defined fully yet, but it's given us a platform to start to like voice concerns and start to show a better way, you know, community engagement design. So we had a big symposium in Ottawa a couple years ago, a couple hundred people that came, and it was kind of the launch for this Indigenous task force in architecture. And then my work personally, I'm working with another Métis who's a relative of mine, and he is an architect. I'm training under him as an intern right now. And I started to work with him on a research project trying to define what this Métis architecture could be. There has been research done into First Nations and Inuit architecture in Canada, but there hadn't been anything like specifically on Métis architecture. So we started to travel around the Métis homeland, and we traveled to as many Métis communities as we could, and photographed and interviewed and started to create kind of a repository for Métis architecture. So we have this website blog up that's got different interviews with Métis architects and designers and elders and different structures that are standing, contemporary, and past. We've had several book chapters published on different things related to architecture. This one was on domestic thresholds and the politics of imposed kind of space. Like I was saying, in those government provided houses that I had images of before, one of the things they did is in the historic buildings, you can see the image on the top right. Like I was saying, there were a 1-bedroom room where everybody slept under one roof together, and there was no sense of privacy or anything. And it was a very communal space. But the government started to impose more rigid, like European style buildings where there was hallways and everybody had their own rooms. And it started to cause a lot of issues in the community. And it's been very damaging to have this culturally irrelevant housing put into our communities. And so I worked on that project with him for a couple of years while I was a grad student. And then kind of at the same time, I was running my thesis project where I worked with an elder to do a cultural center and 4 artist studios. So there's 4 little kind of pavilion structures and a larger cultural center that I designed with in my thesis. And it was near a historic Métis site where there was resistance in the late 1800s between Métis people and the government of Canada. I think it was one of only like 2 civil disobediences, I guess, or like civil wars almost that happened. So it's a hotspot for Métis culture, and historically and contemporary, there's a historic site there. So we were working in that area. and kind of using storytelling and like dreaming as narrative. So part of the work that informed my thesis was the elder I worked with, a relative of my mom's. She had told me a story, like a dream, about paddling back and forth across a river and bringing people back and forth and in a canoe. And she was in her dream, she was trying to figure out why she was doing this, and her uncle was with her, and her uncle in the dream was telling her that you're doing this, you're bringing people back to their culture through art. So this was like a vision or a dream that she had. And then we were working together on thesis. So it was kind of like dreaming and narrative and forming like an actual architectural project was playing into it. So just talking about this dream.
It's only accessible by the water.
There's a road there too, but
yeah,
it's an old like ferry. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then like diagramming this out in this dream with like more like traditional kind of like mind maps. So using like talking about like the central like cultural center in this diagram being here and all the things that are important to it. This is kind of like a program diagram, but also kind of like it's like a conceptual program diagram. And then around the circle, you have like each one of the studios and what's important to them and the different ceremonies, the different animals that are.
Is it connected to the true north and these are kind of solstice?
Yeah. So like the medicine wheel is like a traditional like teaching, like method, and it aligns to the east and the west, and it kind of informs a layout of the actual program in the building. Like the entrance to a lot of the lodges and structures are faced to the east or the southeast traditionally, because that's where the sun rises. And when you pass on, you go through like the western door. So it's kind of like a complex like layered diagram. And then each direction has an animal that's associated with it. And then the lunar cycles and the calendar, the traditional calendar here goes by the lunar cycles. Each moon is related to different things that are happening at different times of the year. Like we have a goose moon when like the geese are flying again, and like a frost moon and a rut moon, all those different things. So trying to align like the studios conceptually, but also like physically and how they were laid out on the site. So this kind of like informed a lot of the design and work of the like studios.
Okay, this is interesting.
Yeah. And then each studio like related to a landscape because it was along a river. So this studio is located on like a prairie or a plain. So you wanted to be able to like look in or look out in all the directions and kind of see out. So it had like a series, this is a perspective section, like a series of sliding partitions that you could block the wind if you needed to, or frame different views. And it had like a central hearth fireplace in it, and like a sleeping kind of nook, and then an oculus to look up and see the stars and connect with the stars, because the stars like traditionally have teachings and meaning. Like I think probably almost in every culture, like astronomy, the constellations are different, So this is kind of just inside, just a conceptual rendering, looking out like onto the prairie on the site. So all these shutters, it could close up and it could open up depending on the weather and the season and the conditions. So it's trying to respond to landscape. And then this studio is called like the Eagle Studio, and it was relating to that eagle in the diagram in that direction. And it's up on a hill in like the highest point of land overlooking the river. So it's like conceptually seen as like a nest, like a nest-like structure that would open up. These ribs can like pull up to the top on a pulley system, and you actually like climb up into the nest. It's on like really thin piers, and there's a central fireplace in it. So this is the view from that site looking back across. You can see where the like canoe was crossing conceptually, and so it's connecting to like that animal and that kind of landscape and how they view the land. And kind of the structure, it's like wings, everything's kind of connecting back to that. And then this one is like a bear's den. Bears hibernate here in the winter, and it's connecting to that direction and that animal. So it's like a heavy den-like structure made of rammed earth, the large chimney. So it's kind of like a den, and you can like so it's just like each studio was like very different and responded to like a different local landscape and kind of inhabited the land in a way that like different animals and stuff that were important to the diagram. And then this is like the main cultural center and kind of the hub and everything where, you know, people could teach and people could do cultural practice. And yeah. So that was my thesis work. We're working now on, they're rewriting the technical standards handbook in Canada. This is through a firm for housing. So they're trying, Indigenous housing, they're trying to do like community-led participatory design, you know, so the community input's like really important into the design. So this is just like a sketch diagram that my boss had done. I can't really share a lot of the images on that yet because it's in progress, but I would be happy to share when it's coming. But what we did is like, we had to pick 4 remote communities that don't have any road access. They're fly-in only. So we tried to pick them like across the nation to get like a sample of different culture and different First Nations. And then we partnered each one of those communities with the First Nations architect in Canada that was closest to their culture, grew up closest to that community. So they had an understanding of the landscape and the culture. And they worked with the community on doing 4 different like housing prototypes for each community, using like local materials and taking inspiration from something like this, which is like a traditional smokehouse, because it can be really hard to get materials into these communities because they're like plane access only or boat access only. So we're trying to, you know, use contemporary technologies and 3D modeling and all these like contemporary, like cutting edge technology, but merging it with like traditional cultural practice in the community to try to create like, you know, the best kind of housing options for the communities where they're in charge and it's, you know, self-determination. And they're doing stuff, you know, aside from the houses that I had showed you before, the substandard houses. And then there's like lots of really good cultural stuff that's still going on. I just thought I'd include, this is pretty interesting. These wooden boats are like a regionally specific thing to Métis culture that we build here. And you can see one aluminum boat, like a modern boat in the back, but primarily everybody's still building these. So part of my work too is outside of architecture. It's more in construction and handcraft, and keeping these like traditions alive in communities. So I went and documented the build of one of these with elders and are doing like a booklet and drawing set. So these boats are like an evolution from a historic boat that was used to like move furs in and out with the trading companies, like beaver pelts and stuff hundreds of years ago. And they just like keep evolving and evolving when like different materials come in. So they used to be all hand cut, hand split wood, but now they're using plywood and glue and nails. But like if you look back at the old boat, you can still see it in these new designs. So this just kind of the process of building one of these boats. They go together in about a day, and they're built by the local people, and they don't cost very much to build, and they're like really interesting kind of a craft. So it's just kind of to show that there is still a lot of really like inventive people that are using, you know, contemporary materials and kind of like appropriating them, you know, in contemporary ways, using contemporary tools, but like still doing like historic forms of building, you know. And then this was just another project I worked on maybe 5-6 years ago as a student worker, where this was really successful. It was in a remote community, and it's all mass timber. And these 4 guys you see in the photo, they put this whole thing together. They were the only 4 workers that were able in the community. So it coming in like these large cross-laminated timber pieces that were all prefabricated. They were able to assemble it like a kit of parts. So it's an all wood structure that was, you know, locally assembled. It built capacity in the community. Like these guys were very proud of it and kind of heroes of the community, you know, because they were able to put this entire structure together in a very short time, and just the 4 of them, you know, with like limited experience and expertise. And then this is the last little project I'll show you too. It's an addition to an existing building for a cultural building, or it's an education institution and cultural institution. So this was existing, and then we built this. We worked on this addition with another firm in Saskatoon. It's not a real exciting building typology. It's has a publishing department in the basement, an office level, and storefronts on the main level, and an art gallery on the upper level. But again, trying to get to this like, you know, mass timber and using some of the design inspiration, I guess, that you saw from the original homes and like using more contemporary materials? So yeah, I didn't want to talk too long. I wanted to have some discussion, so that's what I have.
Thank you, Jason. Nice. Thank you, Jason. I'd like to ask you a few questions. As we know, if we go back to the definition of vernacular architecture, as we all know, it's a kind of architecture that has not been done by architect. Mainly, it is constructed by locals and with the local material construction and techniques. So, from your experience, what did drive you to go through this experience and this kind of let's say direction?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a way of like, I see it as like the truly kind of sustainable architecture on a larger scale, not just like the LEED certified small definition of sustainable that a lot of people seem to follow. It's a larger picture, like sustainable, like this is a way that people have lived here for a very long time, and they can use very limited tools and resources to build structures that stand for 150 years with no maintenance on them. Had somebody been maintaining them, they would last a lot longer. You know, and the materials that are used and the way that they build the structures responds directly to a landscape, which is grounded in place, you know, that I have an understanding of. And I think that that's really at the root of why I kind of follow this way of architecture and thinking is, I think that we've strayed so far with technology, being able to turn an air conditioning unit on here or being able to have a furnace, you know. We don't have to think about how we orientate our buildings and what they're built of. You know, technology allows us to kind of cheat the system. Whereas these like more traditional forms of building, they're truly sustainable because they don't really rely on those systems nearly as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this sorry, so
yes.
This will lead us to the question of the relationship between the humans and nature as well.
Yeah. Let's go back. I really like this image here. This cabin is one of my favorites. But yeah, I think what you're asking there is at the root of it. It's betterment of the relationship between human and their environment, for sure, is really driving this kind of movement. We've seen it in the eastern part of Canada. There's been kind of a critical regionalist approach to architecture for some time now, really led by Canadian architect Brian McKay-Lyons, I would say, who I think is a friend of Peter Stutchbury and Glenn's, you know.
Yeah. Jason, I want to ask you, do you, in the past, do you usually gather into small communities, separate in the land, and now the government is trying to put everyone in one kind of village or city?
I think that happened a long time ago. Every culture here is a little different. You know, Canada is a huge country, but in my area, like a lot of families would spend part of the year together in larger groups, but then they would break out and go hunting in different areas. And we're not entirely nomadic people by any means, but semi-nomadic, and would kind of live their life and move, you know, with animals and hunting and what kind of natural resources could be gathered. And I think that, yes, that has happened for First Nations. Like they've been put on like reserve lands. Typically, a lot of the areas weren't picked by them. The government took the best pieces of land and moved them into kind of sedentary like communities, but that's been ongoing for quite a while. It's
Okay.
still kind of displacement is still happening. Sometimes you see like hydroelectric projects and stuff where they want to flood certain valleys where communities are. They'll get relocated and stuff. Actually, this cabin was demolished by the National Parks Service of Canada in the 1920s to make way for a national park. So they actually came in and destroyed this cabin and removed this family out of this area into a community.
Okay, and for the food you are eating now, is it exactly the same as before, or it's just combined with?
Oh, it's combined for sure. It's a hybrid. I think we use tons of modern food as, of course, and stuff. Like we eat in town and stuff sometimes. But myself personally, like I try to harvest as much wild meat and berries and fruit and mushrooms as possible. But that would be a full-time job on its own, and being an architecture intern architect. But some communities do exist, 80-90% probably still on traditional foods, and some communities nobody is harvesting traditional foods anymore either, depending where they live. And some areas are very urbanized in Canada now, and access to wildlands and animals like that aren't really possible anymore. And then some areas are completely wild still, like when you look at the north,
Yeah.
And for your area, Jason, what about the energy? How do you manage the energy in terms of electricity, water, sewage system, transportation? So do you still do you use natural energy, or how is
it's a mix for a lot of it's a mix for a lot of people. It depends where you are, but most people are like, almost all the communities here, they're pretty much everybody's hooked up to electricity. I don't know very many people that aren't hooked up to electricity. There are a few people that do live completely off grid, like in the wild, that have a generator or solar power. But in the province, a lot of the energy is done through natural gas heating, like furnace heating. But most people have like a backup wood burning stove in their house, just in case of power outage or anything like that. But interestingly enough, again, in the houses I was showing you, now a lot of the government will mandate, like they're not allowed to run wood stoves in these homes. And they get them to have to use oil furnaces to heat and electricity from the grid. And I've talked to people up in these flying communities that are paying $2,000 a month Canadian for electricity to heat their house. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're not allowed to have a wood stove.
La question, en fait, c'est pas une question. Toutes les images que nous a montré Jason, on renvoie directement au film. Un film Into the Wild, donc le film Into the Wild. Quand il est parti vers l'aventure, le petit gars, il a ramené avec lui un livre. Et c'est un livre culte de tous ceux qui partent. C'est le Thurou, c'est Walden David. D'ailleurs, هذا هو اللي عاطف il y a 2 ans, le livre وما زلت نقرأ ونعاود فيه. Donc, David Thoreau, il est parti pour redécouvrir soi et redécouvrir la vie, et il a enfin, David Thoreau, il est pratiquement le premier philosophe américain, et il est le livre aux alentours de 1840. Donc, il a renégocié tout. Il a renégocié et l'autonomie, l'agriculture, la culture, la construction, ou le cas fait l'état premier de la nature, avec les éléments de nature, et comment est-ce qu'il a vécu il a vécu pendant 2 ans et 2 mois dans une cabane, dans une forêt, Donc, communion avec la nature, c'est une valeur refuge. À chaque fois, on revient à la nature et à l'acte premier pour partir vers l'avant et pour vivre une autre expérience. Et à chaque fois que l'humanité qui se coince, يعاودوا يرجعوا للديبار. D'ailleurs, j'aime pas l'invention de l'architecture par les architectes. La notion architecte, c'est une notion de la Renaissance, la définition. Celui qui a l'acte de faire de l'architecture, c'est quelqu'un qui réfléchit, qui il la dessine sur ce qu'il la la maquette, et il la construit. Donc, éventuellement, est-ce que c'est des bâtiments, est-ce que c'est des temples, sans architecte? Non. Alors, celui qui fait le process d'imaginer et d'exécuter, il est quelque part, il est un architecte. Donc, Habit, يفسر لنا هكا شنو هو الامباكت نتاع هذه سوسيتي بريم الاولى حبش les indigènes à chaque fois qu'on est coincé on revient au départ pour aller vers l'avant.
Yeah, I think spending time with indigenous people of anywhere you travel to and learning from how they inhabit the land, because they've been there for thousands or tens of thousands of years, and they understand everything about the land and the materials that are available. I think that is the biggest asset and the way to approach it. And even how I work in different communities in Canada, they're also diverse, that we spend time in our design process. We always give ideally 4 or 5 days, or even a week sometimes, for the first visit in the community, instead of just going in for a day or an afternoon to take some pictures and leave. And we'll try to go out on the land and hunt and learn and camp with those people and see how they utilize the landscape, and I think that is really the definition of true sustainability, is looking at how those people are living in a land, because they've been able to be there for 5,000-10,000 years and continue to live there, and I think spending time with them is important and learning their traditions. But then, like I was alluding to earlier, using your mind as a designer and architect and the tools at your disposal, your technology, and how do you take the moves that they've done to inhabit a landscape, and how do you take that into contemporary technology and contemporary materials? How do you translate that? So you're not just mimicking and copying the past, but you're getting at kind of what's embodied, the embodied knowledge, within the way that they inhabit a place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Actually, we debated this I think 1 week ago about the heritage in architecture, and we said that maybe we don't need to copy. We need only to take the essence of the architecture, to learn how they did that, the tools, and take inspiration from that. We don't need to copy it. Like the images we did, you showed us about the schools where they add people on it.
Yeah.
Totally different.
Yeah, it has no it doesn't have the essence or the spirit or the knowledge or wisdom of that traditional structure. It's a copy that's just made in metal, and it's not doing anything that the original structure is achieving,
Yeah. So okay, it's like
I'll go. Sorry, I'll go a little bit through the spiritual aspect of this kind of architecture and settlement. During your presentation, you showed us a kind of oculus opening to the sky, and what kind of relationship the community is entertaining with with the spiritual aspect of the cosmos in general. You showed us, as I said, the Oculus showing to the stars, and it did not develop this relationship with the outside of the overall cosmos, which is I think in somehow there's a kind of importance in that.
Yeah, for sure. So like ceremony is really important to a lot of communities, and again, just like talk about like all the different indigenous groups and language groups, like they all kind of have their own variation and their own ceremony, so it's very diverse across the entire nation. But a lot of the ceremonies are still held in communities, and they inform a lot of kind of decision making in the communities and relationship to land. Like a land-based kind of spirituality. There's different clan systems that honor different animals and different teachings that way. So a lot of the ceremonies and teachings around here are done like to honor the bear as an animal, and that kind of informs a lot of different things in terms of design. It's hard to talk about a lot of it too. A lot of the ceremonies are very experiential. And a lot of them are kind of closed doors and stuff too. Like there's a lot of stuff in ceremony that is done in the spiritual aspect that isn't like really public as well. And in terms of playing into architecture, I think that like if you're able to travel to an area with indigenous people and spend time and get to know them well enough to do ceremony with them and stuff, I think that will really inform the design process, possibly, and your relationship with that local land. You know, the ceremony is like, it's all land-based, so they honor different animals that are from this area. So it makes a lot of sense, you know, if you're on the land here. If you're not from the place and you're not physically on that land, it's kind of a different, it would seem out of place and stuff, but when you come to the area, it's hard to describe, but it's all land-based ceremony, you know.
Okay, and do you have different seasons from what is said in the calendars? I mean, I'm referring to that presentation from Peter Statuary when he was talking about the indigenous seasons. It's like 9 seasons in 1 year, and it's depending on patterns of weather and the relation of it with the earth. And he said that it's no sense to follow the 4 seasons. Everybody knows winter, spring, summer, and autumn. While you have more deep system that is more connected to the land you are in. Do you have such thing, Jason, there?
Yes, yeah, it's connected to the lunar calendar and the 13 moons. So there's 13 different moons. I have them. There's like an eagle moon in the spring when the eagles start to show up, you know. There is a goose moon when the geese start to show up again, a frog moon when the frogs start to hatch, an egg-laying moon, the feather molting moon, and the babies are losing their feathers, flying up moon when animals start flying in August, and then kind of a rutting or a mating. So it goes on, like, and it's regionally specific to each kind of language group. Because it's land-based, right? So it's based around the animals that are in different areas.
One more thing,
each
Jason.
Community take on it.
Yeah, Jason, one more thing. I noticed that most of the plans you showed us are more kind of open plans. So it means that culturally, it's more, there's a kind of interaction between different people. And there is no kind of partitioning or dividing the different zones and area, which is give us the space, more flexibility. So can you talk more a little bit about the cultural aspect of this, which leads to this kind of organization?
Yeah, you're exactly right on making that point. Like if you look at the traditional structures, like the teepee that you kind of see in some of the images, it's like a central hearth, so everybody's kind of spatially organized around the heat or this kind of fire, and that forms a hearth or almost the hearth of a space, you know. And it gives warmth and sustenance, and keeps people going. And there is no interior partitions in the traditional structures in this area, and that was definitely like, it's socially there, it creates like a different social environment, I guess, that we don't really have anymore. Like we have so much privacy now through partitioning and stuff, and I think like the loss of that kind of openness, you know, and having this privacy has had really negative impacts on communities. It's like totally altered the social life and this is family organization. Traditionally in the Métis homes, like the grandmother and grandfather would actually sleep near the front door of these like large open plans, and they could keep an eye on who's coming and who's leaving the house, because it was more of an open door, you know, so to keep the family safe and stuff, they would always have eyes on what's going on.
Okay.
So it's definitely changed, you know, but it hasn't been for the better, I think.
Il y a un texte écrit philosophe kantian en 1780 يحكي فيه على معناها la civilisation aux anciens. Nous qui nous croyons instruits, nous aurions donc souvent le besoin d'aller chez les peuples ignorants pour apprendre d'eux le commencement de nos découvertes. Car c'est surtout de ce commencement dont nous aurions besoin, nous l'ignorons parce qu'il y a longtemps que nous ne sommes plus les disciples de la nature. Donc, être ces disciples de la nature et comprendre l'avancement des choses. Comment est-ce que ces points-là, ils peuvent être... parce que réellement, même dans notre histoire, on a nié le savoir indigène. Ça a commencé avec la colonisation et après, dans le Istanbul, pas très le savoir indigène, le savoir paysan, le savoir, mais on parle de savoir plusieurs fois millénaire. Celui qui sait fonctionner avec la nature, qui sait cultiver la terre de manière authentique et tirer profit de l'environnement terre, il a un legs plusieurs fois millénaire. C'est pas un truc qui vient d'aujourd'hui. Et c'est ça, en fin de compte. Notre civilisation, la civilisation, disons, moderne, après l'ère industrielle, elle essaie de standardiser tout. On standardise la technique, l'agriculture, l'architecture, et il y en a oublié ce régionalisme-là à un certain moment qui est très profondément instructeur. C'est une crise d'identité qui nous renvoie à une société de consommation. Et il y a ce mouvement de résistance. Ce que fait Jason dans sa communauté, c'est une sorte de résistance. D'ailleurs, ce qui est important, c'est que le discours أكثر العباد يقعد شوية ويقول la communauté. Mais ça sonne à la limite, c'est شوية bizarre. Tu vois, il s'identifie par rapport à une communauté. مش l'architecte اللي قاعد كي ينظر en dehors du système, tu vois. À chaque fois, ça revient à tout moment, la communauté.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately too, with what's been going on in the world over the last few months. And one word that really comes to mind and idea is this idea of resiliency. You know, like how resilient is your community, you know, and your family and yourself? Like how resilient are you to times and situations like this? I think it's like you're talking about with the consumerism, we've lost this kind of resiliency. And our buildings have lost, and our architecture has lost this kind of resiliency and self kind of like it's not able to self-sustain itself anymore. I think I'm fortunate to have lots of people around me that have, you know, I have a lot of learning to do still in terms of this kind of land-based knowledge, I would call it, and stuff. But I am lucky to have, you know, elders and family members and friends and peers around me that are teaching this kind of knowledge. You know, but now with social media and online too, like there's so much stuff going on, knowledge sharing, you know, among larger communities and like nations and stuff too, in terms of knowledge of this resilient and self-sustainability knowledge that's kind of floating around. So it's really unfortunate what's happened with this pandemic crisis around the world, and a lot of people have passed on. But coming out of this, I think keeping in mind this resilient kind of architecture, you know, and it's kind of from this critical regionalist approach too, is how do we create, and it comes back to kind of that point I've been talking about a lot, is like truly sustainable architecture from a land, you know, that can inhabit a land in a low impact and like sustainable way, you know, in an indigenous way, you know. Everybody is indigenous to somewhere, or like everywhere in the world has an indigenous way of building, you know. But I think we've kind of left it behind over the last 150 years, and I think it's time to bring that knowledge back into all of our work, you know.
You know, guys, to tell you the truth, our session today is a little bit complicated because it has many different branches. You know, if we talk about the relationship between architecture and nature or environment, so this is one topic. So if we also talk about skills and indigenous communities, it's another topic as well. The relationship between the architecture and the primitive techniques that were used in the past, you know, knowledge. So we're into many rich topics. I think we cannot in one session, you know, answering all these questions. Even if we take in our area, in our region of North Africa, like in Tunisia, for example, we have this kind also of settlements and this vernacular architecture, which is different from the south to the east, west, and north. So it's each region has its own kind of architecture and culture, and as well different way of settings. But which is important, I think, is that we're opening a little bit the debates and the thoughts about the importance of going back to the nature and the relationship between the man and the environment, which is in the environment in the whole on its overall aspects.
Yeah, by the way, I remember when we were back in Australia and the Glenmarket Masterclass, there was like a kind of particular relationship between Jason, and we had also an Aboriginal master in the masterclass, and we felt that this connection to nature makes them speak the same language, even though they don't speak the same language what we speak. And I found this connection magical because they can understand each other very quickly, and we had this kind of initiation ceremony, and they shared the same. It was held by this Uncle Max and Jason, and I remember it was this kind of communion between you and him. Do you think when you speak to the nature at the end, you can easily speak to each other as indigenous people?
Yeah, I think that connection to land is kind of at the center and core of our belief system, you know, and our spirituality. And I did find that connection with Uncle Max immediately. And I also found like he actually had been to Canada 15 years ago and done ceremony with people that I've done ceremony with in Canada. And we had mutual friends across the world. It was unbelievable.
Well,
yeah.
And one thing also, Atef, maybe I can add, is that also, which is important for architecture, is that you can, wherever is settled, you can understand it. You can really read it, you can feel it, you can saw. So it's a kind of universal language as well. Wherever you are in the world, wherever you are in the overall cosmos, the architecture is like music. So just you can, in music you can hear the sounds, and in architecture you can feel it, you can touch it, you can live in it, you can see it, you can. So that's also the beauty of architecture as a discipline as well.